I'm Donnie Deutsch.
And I'm Mark Halpern. With all due respect to Donald Trump's mouth, next time, you might just want to put the safety on. On the show tonight, we'll break down ads, we'll break down polls, and we'll hope that Donnie doesn't have a breakdown over the election. Let's get started. We've got a brand new Bloomberg Politics national survey out today. It shows Hillary Clinton beating Donald Trump 50% to 44% in a two-way race. The margin drops slightly when the two leading third-party candidates are added to the mix. We're going to talk more about those poll findings in just a minute. But first, Trump and his campaign are still dealing with the fallout from the Republican nominee's remark about Second Amendment people yesterday. News reports now that the Secret Service has had conversations today with the Trump campaign about that comment out of concern that the remark could incite violence against Clinton. Trump and his campaign are still saying he was talking about voter mobilization, while some Republicans, including former campaign manager Corey Lewandowski and the Speaker of the House Paul Ryan, are going with a different talking point, that the whole thing was just a joke gone bad. That's what a lot of people in the press are thinking. Here's what Trump had to say about this matter at his rally this afternoon in Abington, Virginia.
A big part of the rig system is the press itself, because they can take a little story that isn't a story and make it into a big deal. Happens so much. And speaking of that, remember this. We have so many things that we have to protect in this country. We have to protect our Second Amendment, which is under siege. Remember that. It's under siege.
It happens so much. It's under siege. As Trump was still speaking at that rally, Hillary Clinton weighed in during her own campaign event this afternoon in Des Moines, Iowa.
Words matter, my friends. And if you are running to be president, or you are president of the United States, words can have tremendous consequences. Yesterday, we witnessed the latest in a long line of casual comments from Donald Trump that cross the line. His casual cruelty to a Gold Star family. His casual suggestion that more countries should have nuclear weapons. And now his casual inciting of violence. Every single one of these incidents shows us that Donald Trump simply does not have the temperament to be president and commander-in-chief of the United States.
Two of the reasons this story is dominating the news cycle are because many reporters are explicitly dismissing the Trump's campaign position as an outright lie, and also because some of those skeptical voices are coming from conservative Twitter and the usually friendly Fox News channel. Both the Clinton and Trump campaigns are trying to raise money off of this. Has it done any permanent damage to Donald Trump, Mark?
I think not as big as the Clinton campaign had thought yesterday, not as big as I thought it would yesterday, in part because the Trump campaign has stuck to its guns, and pardon the pun, and suggested he wasn't making a joke about it. I think if the Secret Service investigation leads somewhere, it'll do a little bit more. I basically think this is yet another thing that will be still in the public imagination come the fall, when if there are Republicans, both voters and elites, who want to abandon Trump, they'll all be choosing from a menu. Susan Collins chose Trump's remarks about 3 different people. This is something people could seize on. I don't think it's causing major damage yet, pending the Secret Service investigation, but I think it's causing some.
I agree with you, and I'm going to put it in a kind of a brand frame. We have what we call brand positionings, and right now the negative brand positioning for Trump is unstable. This is one more. We also have a term called brand support points. This is one more support point, and that's what
for the negative side of his brand.
On the negative. So that's what I'm just saying. It's basically now it's in the list. It's in the list with the Khan issue. It's in the list with the hacking into the Russians hacking into Hillary's emails. It's in with the McCain not being a war hero. Now it's probably support point number 7. So it doesn't change the math. Gives you one more tool to play with.
The press shouldn't be biased. It should cover everything in regards to the public interest. But the reality, just saying what is, not what ought to be, is the press plays favorites at times. And Trump used to be the press's favorite. Now, amazing to the Clinton campaign, they're getting better coverage. They normally don't. I think one reason this is bad for Trump is he's got another big fight with the press. The press thinks he's a liar. He's mad at the press for the way they're covering it. The more there's tension between Trump and the press, I think the lower his chances of winning.
I think also the press doesn't need him anymore. I think that basically this was the story of a generation, and we're 90 days away from an election. And I think the press by nature usually does lean more Democratic. We know that, just who they are as human beings. And I think there's a kind of part of their voice, whether they're conscious or subconscious, that's coming up at this point and go, okay, we've played the game, we've carried you to this point, but now a little of that bias may be coming out.
Should say Trump just tweeted that there was no meeting, despite news reports to the contrary, no meeting or conversation ever happened between the Secret Service and the Trump campaign regarding what he said yesterday. But we do know the service, they tweeted yesterday, they are concerned about it. All right. Let's talk more now about our new Bloomberg Politics national poll. Came out this morning. As we mentioned, Hillary Clinton has maintained some of her post-convention bounce. She's besting Donald Trump by 6 points in the head-to-head race, 50 to 44%. Clinton is leading with independents, women, including white women, non-white voters, young and unmarried voters, as well as the college-educated. Trump is still up among men, white men with no college degree, people 65 years and older, evangelicals, married voters, and voters without college degrees. Again, we should say, in the four-way race, adding in the Green Party and Libertarian candidate, Trump's deficit is only 4. That's much closer than other recent national polls as we get further away from the Democratic convention. Supporters of Trump and Clinton have vastly different motivations for backing their favorite choice. 56% of Clinton supporters say they're more pro-Clinton than anti-Trump. Trump supporters different. Overwhelmingly, they are more anti-Clinton, they say, than for the Republican candidate. So, Donnie, on these top-line numbers, what's your biggest takeaway from our poll?
The biggest takeaway from the poll is that things have not changed much since the post-convention bounce. It's interesting, if you aggregate all the polls, I think 30 polls, the margin is about 7.3. So the Bloomberg side is a little on the lower side. When I do some of the crosstabs underneath, there's one thing I found interesting, and I'm going to quote the great Mark Halperin. You said a while ago, if Trump doesn't win business, he doesn't win. 61% of people in that poll think he's doing worse. Their perception of him as a businessman has
gotten
gone
worse
south
over time
since the campaign.
Yep.
So if I bow to the church of Mark Halperin, which I and most of America do, that is a very telling number.
Yeah, and obviously he's got to sell his business credentials, and there have been stories both pushed by the Clinton campaign and press has done on their own, looking at Trump's business record, and it is clear that the convention, the Republican convention, didn't rebuild that, although there were efforts at the convention to try to build that up. All right.
Okay, Bloomberg Politics also asked people for their opinions about President Obama and the direction of the country. Half the country said they approved of the job the president is doing, and yet 68% said the country is headed in the wrong direction. And almost half those likely voters said Democrats were to blame, compared to 22% who said it was the Republicans' fault. 30% said they were not sure who to blame. Mark, should Democrats be worried about that? And it flies in the face of basically perception of the parties in general, which the Republican numbers are much lower.
It's a very strange mix. Even as the country blames, according to our poll, blames the Democrats, even if as overwhelmingly has been the case for a long time now, people think we're on the wrong track, they still think President Obama is doing a good job. He's getting close to his highest numbers since his very beginning of his presidency. I can't really explain it.
I think that it's a little bit of a kind of, at the end, as the economy is not in a terrible shape.
Yeah.
So that being said, and he seems very statesman, he gave a great speech. His numbers were good before that.
Yeah.
The one numbers going back to the Bloomberg Pro that to me are still to tell is temperament for president. Hillary Clinton, 56%. For Donald Trump, 31%. How does a guy get elected if 2 out of 3 people do not think he actually has the makeup for that office?
I mean, look, the president, even at his worst moment, his approval rating never got really below 40%. So he's basically gone from the low 40s at his low point to the mid 50s. And obviously he's recovered some of the people who voted for him, who maybe had lost a belief in him. And he's had some successes in foreign policy and at home. But it is a real problem for the Trump campaign. You know, they can cite wrong track all they want, but when a guy who's got half the country, more than half the country, approving of the job he's doing is going to be out there hitting the pavement for Hillary Clinton, it's a problem.
Same numbers Ronald Reagan.
Problem for them. All right. Finally, after Donald Trump complained that some of the general election debates are scheduled currently on nights that have NFL games, we asked likely voters which they'd watch, which they'd be more likely to watch on those evenings if the planned dates don't change. Football against the debates. 69% said they'd watch the debate Only 26 said they'd choose the game. I'll be professionally obligated to watch the debates. Donnie, which would you watch, football versus the debates?
Depends if the Jets are playing. I will. You know, I know they have all this technology now where you can kind of watch.
No, but which would you watch live or picture in picture?
I would. To all of my fans in Queens, they're going to be upset for me. I would actually be watching the debate.
Watch the debate, but picture in picture and watch the game.
Yeah, I could do that. This is, by the way, I think
got to do audio for
those
the debate,
debates will be the biggest number since the moon landing. I don't care what football game.
I've been saying they'll be the most highly watched shows of all time. I'm getting less sure about that.
Oh, no.
Getting less sure. We'll see. There'll be a lot of build-up. They're going to be big.
There's been a 20-month build-up.
They're going to be big, but I literally thought they'd be the biggest TV events of all time. I'm not sure that's...
Well, the numbers don't... People don't consume TV that way overall anymore.
Well, that's part
but certainly over the last 10 years, without question.
All right, when we come back, some Clinton news that Trump's behavior sort of buried and some new Clinton controversies after these words from our sponsors. Over the past 24 hours or so, there have been at least two headlines that, in almost any other election year at any other time, would have dominated the news cycle, and in this case put Hillary Clinton's campaign on the defensive. Those stories have gotten some notice, and we're about to give them more, but once again, Donald Trump has said something controversial that has crowded out the anti-Clinton plotline. This is not a new phenomena, as you know, it's one that's been particularly on display during the period since the conventions. Here's a quick recap of the last week and a half.
Clinton, Trump, buried stories. Here's what happened. Weekend after convention, Clinton goes on Fox.
Director Comey said that my answers were truthful.
The Washington Post says that's not what happened.
That's not true.
Poor Pinocchios.
Hillary Clinton is lying through her teeth.
Could have been the lead of the weekend. Instead, this was the lead. And this. August 1st, Clinton Cash Guy says Clinton's work on a Russian technology initiative may have substantially undermined U.S. national security.
This has bad national security implications for the United States.
But that wasn't the lead. It was still this. Trump also said this and this. August 2nd, DNC resignations after those leaked emails. Still not the lead. Trump did this, this, and this. August 3rd, Clinton repeats claim about FBI, the one that was debunked. Also that day, the Iran cash drop story. But then Trump says this.
They have a perfect tape.
And his campaign says not really. Then he says it again. Then, August 5th, Trump admits he's wrong. Media says rough week for Trump. It all overshadows Clinton's rough presser. Beginning of the next week, reports that Senator Clinton didn't create as many jobs as she'd promised. Trump then tweets a conspiracy theory. August 9th, news that parents of Benghazi victims are suing Clinton. But then Trump says, well, you know.
All right, so that brings us to today and some new news stories about emails from Hillary Clinton's time as Secretary of State. These emails were obtained and released by the group Judicial Watch as part of litigation against various Clinton entities. They include exchanges between aides to Bill Clinton with ties to the Clinton Foundation and State Department officials in which the former president's advisors seem to be seeking special access and special treatment for, in at least one case, a major foundation donor. Voters continue to say they have questions about Hillary Clinton's ethics. There's a new report out tonight from CNN suggesting that the FBI at one point wanted the Justice Department to look into the Clinton Foundation, and the Justice Department declined. I'm sure that will be getting more attention in the days ahead as well. So, Donnie, just looking at these emails, do they suggest that Clinton Inc. operated in a way that voters should be and will be suspicious about?
I want to go back, just like the Clinton brand, unfortunately for them, is seen as unstable. The Hillary Clinton brand is untruthful. So once again, one more support point. The difference between the two, all those support points on the side of Clinton, all the support points here, it's very easy and sexy to say, oh, Clinton made a joke about assassinating Hillary Clinton versus
Trump.
Trump made a joke about assassinating Hillary Clinton versus this stuff is all mushy. It's all you can't. It's not soundbitey enough. It's not sexy enough. It's all, once again, on brand, unfortunately for her, under the untruthful carry. One more support point, but mushy gushy, not as good TV.
There's a level on which this is business as usual. Every administration I've ever covered, their allies on the outside who are in the profit business work to get special treatment. That's not new. What is different here is that when Hillary Clinton accepted the job as Secretary of State, it was clear from the Obama White House's point of view there needed to be some walls put up so that the foundation that her husband was running didn't create problems. And in this case, you had a variety of people raising money for the foundation, getting rich on their own, with allies and friends and colleagues in the administration. And these emails show a pattern of Clinton Inc. doing exactly what the critics suggest, which is moving stuff along so that everybody wins, except in some cases, critics would argue, the American people.
More of the same. But once again, as you were telling me that story, I was thinking about my dry cleaning, and I was thinking, no, it's a very.
They're going to need.
You can't.
They're going to need to make this breakthrough.
People are not talking
to make this breakthrough as more than just a hum.
The average person already says, you know what, Hillary Clinton, she thinks she plays above the law.
Yeah.
She's untruthful. I can't trust her. One more support point, but not a very clear, interesting, sexy.
I agree. I agree. If they're going to need to find, I believe, to really break through, is somebody getting a favor from the State Department they should not have gotten.
Yes.
That helped enrich the foundation or a Clinton ally. This doesn't do that, but it does show the way Clinton Inc. operated.
Something when I'm eating my Lucky Charms in the morning.
More needs to be done on this story.
Here's another controversy the Trump campaign believes should be a bigger deal. Yesterday, there was a not-so-welcome person spotted just over Clinton's shoulder as she spoke at a rally in Florida. Turns out it was the father of the gunman who killed 49 people at an Orlando nightclub in June. The father suggested he had been invited to the event by a mass email and that he supports the Democratic candidate. The Clinton campaign has said it was an open event, that they didn't know he was there, and that she disavows his support. Mark, is the Trump campaign going to have something to play with here?
I said there should be more work done by journalists on the foundation and its ties to the State Department. This one, I think, I don't understand why Republicans are pushing it. The campaign has disavowed the guy in no uncertain terms. They don't want his support. Bad optics that he showed up at the event, but no one has demonstrated that they invited him. He showed up. They disavowed his support.
Yeah.
I just don't see what the story is.
The only clearance in an event like this for about 3,000 people is you go through a metal detector. They're not doing background checks on people. And I don't want to start. My initial instinct was, I bet Trump's people sent him there. And not in a horrible way. That's what people do in these crazy political campaigns. How is this guy there? He had a list of signs that were like talking points. So, I didn't go to some great, major conspiracy thing, but my instinct was, pretty clever.
Look,
Trump sent him there.
If the campaign invited him, although, again, it would have been a mistake because obviously they wouldn't have invited him on purpose. If they invited him or if the Trump campaign sent him, I have no reason to believe either of those is true. Yeah, that deserves more scrutiny.
Yeah.
But in the absence of any evidence of either of those things, I'll just say again, Republicans are hurting themselves because they've already got a candidate who gives them few windows to break through. They had a window until Trump said the thing he said yesterday. They have a window now as that dies down. Push the Clinton Foundation and try to explain to people, or push this non-story. Seems pretty obvious to me. They can't waste their time on things that aren't going anywhere, and I can't see how this one's going to go anywhere once they repudiated the guy.
Yeah. Once again, the foundation story, I'm a guy who spent my life communicating. Tough story to tell. Very, and by the way, it's funky, and there's no question about it, and there's some nasty quid pro quo there. And by the way, Hillary Clinton is not a very believable, trustworthy person. There needs to be something cleaner. There needs to be something.
And particularly because this one involves AIDS. It doesn't involve her. There's no evidence that she knew about any of this stuff. And again, there's no evidence that the people lost out, that the taxpayers lost out, or somebody got a job or a contract improperly. But it does show the way her empire operated. But I agree, the bar's higher now because of what we've already seen. All right, coming up, more on what's up with Donald Trump from a reporter who covers him pretty much around the clock when we come back. Trump campaign has still not made an ad buy on television for the general election. Hillary Clinton, though, is spending aggressively on the airwaves. She has ads on in several battleground states, as well as during the Olympics in national primetime purchases, all to the tune of more than $2.4 million in just the past month alone. Both candidates, of course, have super PACs and interest groups helping them out. And we're beginning to see some pretty interesting down-ballot ads from candidates running for other offices. So we thought tonight we'd show you some of the most interesting and potentially effective spots that are on the tube right now, starting with this new anti-Clinton ad being run by the National Rifle Association. Starts today in Nevada, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and North Carolina, as well as on national cable and broadcast as part of a $3 million ad buy.
She's one of the wealthiest women in politics. Combined income, $30 million. Tours the world on private jets. Protected by armed guards for 30 years. But she doesn't believe in your right to keep a gun at home for self-defense.
I fully appreciate how hard life is for so many Americans today.
An out-of-touch hypocrite. She'd leave you defenseless.
All right, so the NRA is stepping up big with that ad, and that seems to go to the theme we talked about before, Clinton being out of touch. I think it's a pretty good spot.
Two issues spot. Once again, that really seemed like Donald Trump more would be in that milieu, if you will.
Yeah.
One thing in an ad, and it's interesting to put this for people at home, political ads go under less scrutiny than an ad if you're selling Cheerios. If that was a regular ad, you'd have to say this is a dramatization. That's not Hillary Clinton, which it wasn't. And it's very artfully done. But what's so ironic in this country, the most important thing we buy a candidate, there is less regulation than there is for tobacco powder or anything else.
I remember in 1992 when Bill Clinton was in third place behind Ross Perot and Herbert Walker Bush. The Clinton campaign research showed people thought he was born rich, and he wasn't, and that she was born rich and she wasn't. And they spent a lot of time in the run-up to the convention, at the convention, telling people about their upbringing. This Clinton campaign has done the same thing. A lot of the Democratic convention was telling the story, a very sad and tough story of her mother's life and of her life. And yet a lot of people will buy into the kind of imagery of this NRA ad because the fact is the Clintons, since they got to the White House and beyond, have lived a pretty high-flying life.
I guess I challenge the strategy of a multi-billionaire pointing to the other candidate saying, look how rich she is, and look how disattached she is, as he shows pictures of him sitting on, Trump Air Force One eating his Kentucky Fried Chicken.
Right.
From another candidate, I get it. From Trump, I wouldn't go down that path.
Yeah, well, George Herbert Walker Bush did it against Mike Dukakis in 1988 when he convinced people he was kind of more in touch with people. I believe that, often these outside groups do not make good ads. The outside groups often, the campaigns, whether they're on the air themselves or not, look at these outside groups, the super PACs, and they're like, oh, why can't they make better ads? My guess is, I haven't asked the Trump campaign about that spot. I just saw it today for the first time. My guess is they're pretty happy with that because that does dovetail with their message. And it's a well-produced spot.
Well-produced. I actually think what the Clinton ads that they've run so far, the kid with the little kids and the kids with the, and the ads about all the conservative people saying Donald Trump is unfit, I think they have done both strategically very sound, but artfully very well done ads. Some of the best political ads I've ever seen.
The early Clinton ads when she was running against Sanders did not get great reviews.
No.
One of them did, with her hugging a young kid, but most of them have not. And I think you're going to see people say what you said, which is their general election spots so far have been quite strong.
It's an easy target.
All right, want to check in real quick with NBC News correspondent Katie Tur. She's in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, in place to cover Donald Trump's rally tonight. Katie, so much we could talk to you about, but you're out of place. You spend most of your time in front of Trump Tower, and today there's a guy climbing Trump Tower while you're down in Florida.
I heard about that. And the one day that I'm not standing in front of Trump Tower, there's a guy with suction cups climbing over the side. What a day to miss, Mark.
I know. So you're down in Florida. Trump's already done one event today, coming down there to do a big rally. What do they want to talk about today? They obviously don't want to talk about what he said last night in North Carolina. What is the Trump campaign pushing today?
They want to talk about Hillary Clinton and the emails, the ones that came out today that seem to show a link between her and the State Department and the Clinton Foundation.
Okay, Katie,
they do not.
Gotta go. Thank you, Katie. Sorry to cut you off. We'll be right back. So with all this news about Donald Trump and polls today, we decided to call in someone who knows a lot about both those topics. Joining us now, Kellyanne Conway, a veteran yet always youthful GOP pollster and a senior advisor to Donald Trump's campaign. Kellyanne, thank you for coming in. You've been out, as of other people associated with the campaign, talking about what he said yesterday, which we're continuing to talk about. Do you think people are willfully misinterpreting what he said? You think that people are doing it on purpose, or why do so many people interpret it as his saying, joking that my supporters could rise up, the Second Amendment supporters could rise up? Why are so many people getting it from your point of view wrong?
Well, people tend to look at the news through their own political lenses already. I mean, if you're for Hillary Clinton, you take things a certain way. If you're for Donald Trump, you see them a fundamentally different way. Go through any social media feed and you'll see that immediately. So I don't think this particular comment is an aberration from what's been going on in politics this entire cycle for over a year. That said, people aren't playing the entire clip. He was already talking about the Supreme Court and the Second Amendment. And then he said, maybe the Second Amendment people can do something about that. Meaning, I mean, I interpreted the way Governor Pence's running mate interpreted, the way the people at the rally interpreted, apparently, because I saw a bunch of them interviewed on CNN today and in a couple of print pieces, where they said, well, I just thought he's mobilizing the 90 million gun owners across this country. And indeed, just today, the NRA started their media buy in the state of Virginia and elsewhere, where they are trying to mobilize their gun owners.
Kellyanne, we could go back and forth for an hour on that. The first part of that statement that he specifically said Hillary Clinton wants to abolish the Second Amendment. That's just not true.
She's never said she hasn't.
That's just not true.
She's been trying to grab guns.
So
she was the first lady, which is none of her business. An unelected official, U.S. senator.
Yes. Hillary Clinton, you're saying, has come out and said, I don't think anybody in America has the right to bear arms.
No, I would never say that.
But if you're abolishing the Second...
She's been asked about her position on the Second Amendment, and she's done the usual, it sounds like texting with a teenager every time she opens her mouth. She has said, hold on, she has said, she who's running for president, has said she's against the Heller decision, the United States Supreme Court decision that affirmed an individual's right to bear arms. That decision came from a majority of the Supreme Court, including many different president's appointees. She has said very clearly that she disagrees with that decision and wishes that it would go another way. She would have the opportunity as a president, Donnie, to execute executive orders the way the president has done. So the idea that she's not hostile to gun owners or the Second Amendment is really something. It was her predecessor, was Senator Obama, then running for president, who said, people clinging to their gods and their guns and their religion, making fun of all those unwashed people.
You see a difference between wanting to pass additional restrictions as compared to saying you want to get rid of the Second Amendment. Isn't there a difference there?
There is a difference, but what is her position, Mark? She won't say it. She's actually never, we went back and looked at it. She's actually never
Well, she says, I'm a supporter of the Second Amendment.
What does that mean?
Well, it means that
she's meat that other people hunt? I mean, let's be honest here. Yeah. And let's be fair.
It means that Americans have the right to bear arms.
In the last 24 hours, because an objective source did a content analysis, as of this morning anyway, I'm sure it's worse now, there was 5 times more coverage on what Donald Trump said about mobilizing gun owners across this country versus covering the fact that Omar Mateen's father was sat right behind Hillary Clinton at a rally. I'm sorry, I would feel, well, wait a second, where would you feel more safe? Where would you feel more safe? At a rally where the speaker who's running for president says you have a right to protect yourself under your Second Amendment constitutional rights that existed for over 250 years? Or would you feel more safe at a rally where the man who perpetrated the worst mass murder since 9/11 in America's history was standing right behind the candidate?
What was the father rather than the perpetrator?
Father, excuse me, the father.
We talked about it earlier, but I want to show you something. Go back to the first point you made, where you said that if you support Hillary Clinton, you have a different one would have a different interpretation. Look what some people on Fox said about what Donald Trump said yesterday. Okay.
Even Donald Trump's most rabid supporters may be shaking their heads in bewilderment tonight.
What the hell? What was he talking about? Well, I mean, is he talking about what I think he's talking about?
He clarified saying that the Second Amendment.
He didn't mean he wants someone to kill her.
Yes, he did. Will group around him to make sure that she's not elected. That was the clarification from the Trump campaign.
There were 3 different clarifications.
I'm just putting it out.
Yeah, right.
But you can't do it with a straight face.
It's a matter of character. I don't think a man at that age, a year and a few months into a campaign, is going to become responsible. You don't say stuff like that. It can be seen otherwise. And it's not the press, it's not the Democrats. This is a self-inflicted wound.
Imagine if she had said, or somebody had said that about Donald Trump, like carelessly say, oh, maybe someone will assassinate him. I mean, we would all be going crazy.
So as you pointed out as we watched that, many of those people are not supporters of Donald Trump. But that is on Fox News. This is not something, well, Again, I'll just say,
Guys,
I'm trying to
accusing him
understand.
of wanting to assassinate Hillary Clinton.
No,
I mean, that is-
you're
no, they
making
have.
a joke about it.
They have.
By the way,
joke about it. And that's what Paul
That would
Ryan.
never be funny.
That's what Corey Lewandowski said he was doing.
I would challenge you, if we found, and we're not going to be able to prove this out, 10 focus groups of apolitical voters, I think from a pure communicative point of view, 90% of the people would take it that way.
No, that's just not true.
I want to ask you
I
something
do
on a
this for a
personal
living.
level.
That's just not true.
I do it for a living also. I want to ask you a personal question. I'm going to talk to you as a guy who knows Donald as a voter. I'm going to tell you my story, and I think it's a lot of American story. When he started out, I was like, whoa, this could be really, really, really good. He actually called me after I predicted he was going to win the Iowa caucus. He said, thanks. I actually said to him, what can I do for you? I was like, this is pretty cool. I don't love Hillary Clinton. And then the chain, and I, like a lot of people I know, were like that. Wow, maybe this is Ronald Reagan. Maybe this is a guy who will be a statesman, who will surround himself with the right people. Yes, he's a political novice. And then over the last months, a string of things, and we don't need to repeat them ad nauseum in terms of whether it's the Mexican judge, whether it's the ban of Muslims, where myself, as a person who knows him, as a businessman, as an educated person, said what a lot of the polls are saying. I just don't think this guy has the temperament. I used to get unsatisfactories in self-control in elementary school. That was a word. And this is a man that
You've
is...
done very well for yourself.
Yes, I did. This is a man...
So I know where this is going.
But no, this is a man who I just look at, who I have always liked and said, I can't... I'm talking to you as a guy now. If I was talking to you in a bar, I can't vote for this guy. He scares the hell out of me. It's just, it's what I see. Right. Forget the pundits. So, and that's why I think he's going to lose terribly.
And yet Hillary Clinton...
No, I want you to answer the question about
because
him.
because the media only want to cover one candidate.
I'm talking to me.
It's outrageous.
Convince me I'm wrong in that.
Okay, well, you're going to go into a ballot box, and the ballot box is going to say the following. Donald J. Trump, Hillary Rodham Clinton, she's got the Clinton in there, feminist. Hillary Rodham Clinton, I guess Hillary Clinton, Gary Johnson, Jill Stein, maybe somebody else. So Evan McMullin, let's not forget him. Is that his name?
Yeah.
Great. And you're going to have to choose. Nobody is saying to you blue tie, yes or no. This whole thing is covered as Donald Trump, yes or no. It's not a referendum on Donald Trump to most voters. It's a referendum on Hillary Clinton, and they find her to be someone who lies for a living. No,
you're right, which is why people were ready to go someplace.
Why doesn't anybody care today that her emails show that basically the State Department was for sale when she was there as Secretary of State? Go read buried news reports today. This is relevant to Americans.
You're right, but to my point, he makes it impossible.
No, it's what you guys want to cover. You know why you want to cover it? Listen, I don't blame you at all.
I'm not talking as a pundit.
I don't blame the coverage at all, and here's why. He's much more fun to cover. She's a bore, and she lies for a living, and her trustworthy and honesty numbers have only gotten worse. She has not worn well at all. I can argue to you, why isn't this woman at 65% of the female vote if he really takes the wings off of butterflies? Why isn't she at 52, 55% in these swing states that President Obama carried twice? She simply is not. So she is fundamentally flawed in the eyes of many voters, but the idea that we're not covering what is shaping up to be a pretty bad week for Hillary Clinton, if you actually looked at it objectively, between Omar Mateen's father cheering on and saying, hey, I'm part of her Democratic Party. I think she'd, quote, be great for national security.
You're right. And you're validating my point. We're not covering it because your candidate has no self-control.
We did talk on the show both about Mateen and her emails, and I want to ask you about both those. But I just want to clear up one more thing on the question of his remark yesterday. It's been reported the Secret Service has reached out to the campaign. Do you know anything about those discussions?
I can't comment on that.
Do you know anything about them?
I can't comment on that.
What do you think of the service looking into this?
That seems to me to be very typical. I've been in the Secret Service as, it's just an incredible group that's very discreet, and I don't think we should look at them through a political lens whatsoever. So I've traveled with them. I know what they're about.
So we shouldn't read into the degree to which they're taking this seriously because they take everything seriously?
I wouldn't read anything into it because it's the Secret Service. But I will say this. The idea that people have been parading around on cable and network TV suggesting that Donald Trump was calling for any kind of nefarious action criminal action against Hillary Clinton or joking about it, I think is very disturbing to me. I mean, it just goes on and on.
I think it's accurate.
It's accurate that he's calling for her.
He's joking.
Her demise?
It was a bad joke.
Her
and
demise?
You couldn't read it.
And Donnie, let me ask you a question as a woman, of course, not in a bar. You're not going to find me there, but you're welcome to come over anytime.
Oh, thank you.
Listen. What in the world is Elizabeth Warren thinking? Why did certain people get away with saying things? This is a United States Senator who, after Mike Pence was nominated, said, They deserve each other. They're both small, insecure men. You know, calling into question their manhood. Yesterday, saying Donald Trump is he's a quote pathetic coward. She said Donald Trump is a quote pathetic coward who's afraid he's losing to a girl.
There's a lot of name calling. Donald Trump has called women fat pigs. But that's not what we're talking about. They're just stupid names.
She's a United States senator.
How are you comparing?
No, because everybody thinks it's fine, that's okay. And then when he tries to fight back, against people like Elizabeth Warren, it's like, oh,
we're not complaining that he's calling people names. Nobody talked about all the names he's called every one of his adversaries.
Well, they do every day, Donnie. They do every day. The Clinton people are spending gazillions of dollars rehashing
I think you're making a fair point about Elizabeth Warren. I do. I just want to ask you about the email thing, because I know you want to talk about that. We talked about it earlier. Just explain to people who aren't following the latest development closely. You make the accusations that it's corrupt and all that. What did she do wrong in conjunction with people outside asking for favors?
So there are a couple things. First of all, she has said she wanted to have a private server so she could do things like communicate with her daughter Chelsea and exchange recipes and yoga moves. It turns out there's also classified information there, and it turns out there's also people asking for favors while she's Secretary of State that then were procured and secured.
Right, but they weren't asking her directly in this latest batch of emails. I'm just asking.
So she's not responsible for what the people below her do. I mean, Cheryl Mills.
I'm asking.
So there's news reports today.
She's responsible for her staff doing what every administration I've ever covered has done.
Which is help to give mineral rights to people in countries where...
Outside favors?
Yeah, okay, well then, according to Clinton Cash, the movie and the book, her husband's speaking fees basically went like this in the time she was Secretary of State. Maybe a coincidence, but he had been the president 8 years before. I mean, he was a pretty noteworthy guy that people wanted to pay money to hear. Why did that happen? Why, after he's visited the country, do some of their friends get these favors? I think these are legitimate questions that actually affect people, but we're not going to get coverage about it.
Because your candidate can't stay on message.
But just again, we're a little bit over, but just explain why they affect people. I understand the accusation.
It affects people because, look, people already believe that Mrs. Clinton cannot be trusted. That's clear in everybody's polling, including the Bloomberg polls. But this matters because the way one comported herself as Secretary of State and United States Senator, which was a pretty unremarkable record, is the best view we have into how she would operate as president. And this administration has promised to be the most transparent administration ever. That is a complete joke at this point, and she was part of this administration. People want accountability, transparency, and people should care, because everything they hate about the rigged, corrupt system that's not transparent and not accountable, where they think the insiders benefit and there's a special set of rules for them, really applies most to Hillary Clinton.
Okay, I almost never want to try to correct you on polls. I will say you said her honest and trustworthy numbers have gotten worse as compared to Donald Trump.
No, not compared to Donald Trump. Compared to when she started running.
I understand, but she's now roughly even in Fox and other polls.
Right, but it's why they don't like them is different.
Yeah.
The question in this election, for me, will come down to distrust of her versus distaste for him. You know, where will those? That's really the question.
I'd say untruthful versus unstable.
Well, right, but that's not right. But when I'm saying it's your opinion, correct? It's your opinion, but people out there are really struggling, Donnie. I mean, we're blessed around this table.
I talked about my
people out there are struggling, and they want to hear solutions. They want to hear economic plans like the one Mr. Trump introduced on Monday. This election will come down. He knows what he has to do to win. This election will come down to economic security, job creation, but also just who can cure everyday affordability, national security. It will come down to ethics. Ethics is a very important point to people, and there are a lot of people out there just tired of political correctness.
It should come down to that. Unfortunately, it's come down to a referendum on his.
Come back more often.
Okay.
If he had 20 people like you, he would be 20 points ahead.
Kellyanne Conway, thank you. When we come back, a look at paid media and the so-called liberal media right after this.
never been a big fan of John McCain. I just hate the way our veterans have been treated by John. I like people that weren't captured, okay?
Trump even tweeted Senator John McCain should be defeated in the primaries. Graduated last in his class at Annapolis, dummy.
Hello. I said I support the nominee.
If she gets to pick her judges, nothing you can do, folks. Although the Second Amendment people, maybe there is, I don't know.
50 times.
Are you comfortable with Donald Trump possibly having control of the nuclear arsenal?
I support the nominee of the party. If I change my mind, I'll let you know.
The only thing that's changed is John McCain.
That is a new ad that is going on the air today. It's being run by Congresswoman Ann Kirkpatrick. She's running in the United States Senate against John McCain in Arizona. Here to talk about the state of the August ad wars, the guns of August, Ken Goldstein, Bloomberg Politics ad and polling analyst and a professor of politics at the University of San Francisco. Ken is in our Washington bureau. So, Ken, it's not very common, I see every cycle, for candidates who think they're on offense to link an unpopular top of the ticket to a candidate. In Arizona, you think it's a Republican state. Does this seem like a good play to try to link McCain up? What's the effect, the effort there based on?
I always like to say that advertising is also a tell. And everyone's been saying that Arizona is going to become a purple state or perhaps even a blue state. And when we're starting to see national numbers in the double digits, that means that Arizona is going to be competitive in the presidential race. That means that that's going to make that Senate race more competitive. And I think that's what that ad is saying. I think the message in general is a great message for Kilpatrick, the challenger to McCain. But I think it's also our first initial signs that some states that we might not expect to be in play in the presidential race might coming into play. And if they're in play in the presidential race, they're going to make those down ballot races also in play.
Hey, Ken, it's Donnie. I want to talk to you a little bit about spending. We're watching Hillary spend a lot of money right now in the Olympics on some very effective advertising. She spent $58 million. Trump, outside the super PACs, spent zero. You know that you can't just push the button and start the spigot. And I am just stunned that there has been no spending, because sometimes you just can't play catch up. And if he gets past Labor Day, I don't know what he's waiting for, basically.
I'm really speechless. You said you're stunned. I'm completely speechless. Trump only spent $20 million in the primary. Trump has not spent a cent on television, on paid advertising since mid-April. And this is just completely unprecedented. I mean, Mark said the guns of August. It's really only been the gun of August coming from one side, the Democrats. We are completely in uncharted waters when one side has been up and one side has been up at fairly heavy levels. And it's not only that the other side hasn't been up very heavily, the other side hasn't been up at all.
But Ken, at this point, given that Trump hasn't gone on the air with paid media, does it make sense to start in August, the Olympics, people on vacation, or better save his resources and go up in September?
That's a good question, and I think I'm of two minds of that. So not to be a flip-flopper. I would typically agree with what you're saying, that now with the Olympics going on in August, is sort of the dog days of summer, and not the time to go up with a message or a new message. That said, given the fact that he has not been up at all, and that this race is starting to feel baked to me. And we've all gone through races, and there's that time when you look back and you say that was the week or two when things really started to bake in. This race is starting to feel that way to me. Now, I think there's going to be another bite at the apple when we see the debates in September. But even with the caveats of be careful of going up in the dog days of August, I think he's got to get up in some way.
Okay, Ken Goldstein, thank you very much. Enjoyed talking to you as always. We come back, we're going to talk about Donald Trump doing the foxtrot right after this. And if you're listening to us in Washington, D.C., you can now listen to us on the radio at Bloomberg 99.1 FM. We'll be right back. So last night when Donald Trump wanted to defend his controversial remarks about Hillary Clinton that he made in North Carolina, not surprisingly, he went on Fox News. Like most Republican presidential candidates, Trump has always favored Fox over other channels. But since Trump's Khan family controversy, the GOP nominee has only done one interview with a non-Fox national network. It was with ABC News' George Stephanopoulos on the This Week program. The only 5 interviews Trump has done this month that have been national, besides that one, have all been on Fox News. This pattern goes back for months, where Trump has done more Fox than anything else. So, Donnie, it's typical for Republicans to favor Fox, but at this point in the general election, is it smart for Trump to gear his appearances towards Fox?
No, of course not, because you're speaking of converted. He's in a tough position. The media, I believe, and I do believe the media is usually biased left because they're educated, and that's some of the issues. I think the media has brought him along and been co-conspirators. You know, we need him, we need him, we need him, we need him. At this point, they're going, you know, we can bash him. We don't have to play up to him anymore. You know, everybody was beholden to him up until recently. What do we do if we don't have Donald? So they have now all of a sudden said, you know, maybe even a sexier story is taking him down.
Yeah.
We've brought him along. We've carried him along. We don't need him anymore. And I think that's what's happening.
I think you get easier questions on Fox if you're a Republican. So he's not facing tough questions, and he's not creating moments. I mean, there are nights when he does an interview with Hannity. Last night's was particularly softball, where no one gets no pickup whatsoever because he doesn't make any news because the questions are so easy and the answers are therefore non-newsmaking. Trump needs the multiplier effect. He needs to go on Morning Joe. He needs to come on this show. He needs to go on the Today Show. He needs to make news, stand up to a tough interviewer, and then have that message radiate out across the land.
But all those interviewers had their hands a little tied because they didn't want to be banned from covering Trump because he's ratings. Now they realize they get the ratings without him just by simply going at him, and so they don't have to be quite co-conspirators anymore.
Romney made the same mistake. You got to go to tougher places, not just to Fox if you're a Republican. We'll be right back. There's more on our latest Bloomberg Politics national poll on our website, BloombergPolitics.com. Check it out. Coming up on Bloomberg West, the venture capitalists Jeffrey Clavier and Brian O'Malley. Donnie will be back tomorrow, as will I. Thanks for watching. We'll see you then. Same bad time, same bad channel. Sayonara.
I'm Mark Crumpton. You're watching Bloomberg West. Let's begin with a check of your first word news. At this hour, an unidentified man is scaling the all-glass facade of the 58-story Trump Tower on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan. Police have lowered scaffolding and broken through windows and ventilation ducts in an attempt to reach the man, who's moving laterally using suction cups, ropes, and a harness. A Justice Department report out today says Baltimore police officers routinely discriminate against blacks, repeatedly use excessive force, and aren't adequately held accountable